Okay, so for the second half of this lecture, I'll just finish where I left off. Gender roles in the Enlightenment. Before the Enlightenment and before this kind of modern period, gender was seen as more fluid and more along a spectrum, and the prevailing scientific, kind of early scientific knowledge based on, again, ancient learning, Greek and Roman ideas about gender, was that the male is the kind of ideal human being, the standard of what a human should be, and a female is kind of a less than human. A male, the again, it was natural philosophy. It was kind of the science of the times. The understanding was that the female did not have enough heat, so did not fully develop in the womb of the mother. So if the fetus fully reached term or fully reached its heat and potential, it would be a male. But if the fetus reached only partially, it would be a female. And there could be, but this opened up this kind of spectrum of gender. How much heat had the female fetus had, right? Like 90%, 80%, 50, right? So there can be more and less feminine men and more and less masculine or female feminine women or gender, the kind of gender and sex of it, if you understand me correctly, was kind of more fluid. But in the Enlightenment, it's increasingly more rigid, partly due to changes in science and partly also due to changes in the economy. To not get into the details too much, we can see that actually some of the modern ideas came from this time also. So women are understood now with different traits, some of them left over from those ancient ideas, ancient concepts of gender. Women are more passive, maybe less logical. These kind of ideas are becoming more prominent. But another interesting thing is happening with regard to religion is that people are noticing now that religion is more and more a matter of choice. There are also more women going to churches and less men participating. And this, as far as we know, as far as since the records have been kept since this earlier period, about the 16th century, when we have these, or 17th century to the 18th century, when we start getting these good records, from then until now, until 2020, this has been part of the story of Christianity. So, in many ways, Christianity is a women's movement and can be understood that way. There are more women who are involved at almost every level, except for the formal, most visible aspects of hierarchy. So no women popes, obviously, and bishops not yet. But in general, when you look at the actual data of who's actually participating at every level except for the formal positions of power, the most visible positions of power, women are doing more of the praying, saying religion is more important to them, going to more church type services or religious services, giving money more, all pretty much every metric that you can think of to study this is coming out. So this is one of the interesting things that's emerging also in this time period. So the way that gender, enlightenment, and uh, interact with each other is complex. It's complex, and then we can move on to the 18th century, and some of the key points here is that are I think it's here that we meet. Excuse me. Some of these interesting figures, these major figures of the Enlightenment, and we think about how Enlightenment interacts with particular forms of Christianity. So, to start with, we can talk about England and evangelicalism. So, there's a form of religion that emerges at this point, a form of Christianity called evangelicalism, which is especially influential in England and North America. And I wish sometimes that McCullough would have spent a little more time on this, but it's okay. I can supplement somewhat. A lot of the Christianity we are used to in North America and the United States is inflected by evangelicalism. And evangelicalism is an interesting child of the Enlightenment in a way. And so it shows how the story is not so direct, just as with women and women's increased participation during this period where supposedly the secular world is emerging. You also have this phenomenon that some of the most successful, largest, and strongest forms of Christianity come out of this engagement with the Enlightenment. So the very doubts and the questions that the Enlightenment raised and the possibility of a secular sphere could lead people to become like Spinoza, or could lead people to be like some of these other figures we're going to find out about, like Voltaire and Rousseau. But probably more commonly, it would lead people to become something like an evangelical. There are far more evangelicals than there are atheist or agnostic or skeptical kind of philosophers, and the evangelicalism would not be possible without the Enlightenment either. It's exactly the Enlightenment that makes it possible. And what I mean is that by emphasizing kind of the individual as the individual reason, individual choice as paramount, and the common person's individual choice and reason as paramount, The evangelical Christians would have said exactly the same thing. They would have said it does not matter if you were born into the Church of England. It does not matter if you were born into the Congregational Church. It does not matter who your parents are. It does not matter who told you these things. What matters is that you yourself make a decision with your own will and understand with your own mind and accept with your own heart Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, something like that, right? This has been a common kind of evangelical phrase or understanding for hundreds of years. And that comes out of that Enlightenment concern with the individual conscience being sovereign, being so powerful, and being so necessary to convince that every person's conscience matter, that every person's choices matter. That is an Enlightenment trope or understanding, and also an evangelical one. And evangelicals borrowed even a lot of the language of the Enlightenment in terms of natural philosophy, right? So believe your own eyes. Galileo believed his own observations, what he saw with his instruments. Well, evangelicals used a lot of the same language. I know, for instance, I know that I'm born again because, an evangelical test, a standard one might read, right? Mary Smith, know that I am an evangelical because on April 14th of 1764, right, I was before my Bible on my knees praying, and suddenly I felt the goodness of God, and it came to me at 3 p.m., right? So there's this very empirical description, almost like a scientist, right? April 15th, 3 p.m., 1764. I was on my knees. This happened. I can write it down. Evangelicals loved writing journals and notebooks and these kind of things. And studying for themselves, studying the empirical evidence of the Bible, reading the Bible themselves to find proof for their faith, for their salvation, and these kind of things. So you can see how obviously there's some tension there because Enlightenment figures want to trust personal reason, personal intelligence, personal will, and evangelicals are commonly saying that the individual will is fallen, is sinful, needs to be redeemed. But in a lot of ways, in a deeper way, in a way, they're kind of following each other because they're both of them are emphasizing the individual and trying to emphasize individual reason and individual will. Even if one says it's fallen and needs to be redeemed, and the other one's saying, well, you can use it to understand the world around you, and maybe that's all that there is. Some more secular forms of the Enlightenment say that that's all that there is. But anyway, you can see this kind of connection between the two, and then we can move to France. So that's North America, the kind of American forms of Christianity that you're familiar with. Like I said, are children of the Enlightenment that way, and England. And then in France, we have a different situation, which is that Catholicism is dominant in France. And one would think, looking at France, that it's in a great shape. It's gonna flourish. We would not have predicted, if you were around France in the 1780s, before 1789, basically, almost up to the last minute, you would not have predicted the revolution would start in France, and that the most thoroughgoing, the most strict anti-Christian, kind of God, anti-theist even, ideas of the Enlightenment would come out of France, because France was so predominantly Catholic and very rich and very powerful and very respected in Europe, in some ways much more than England. So France is the center of the faith. Why did it become a hotbed of revolution? Why was there such a strong reaction, an anti-Catholic reaction? And so part of this has to be understood with this group of people called Jansenists and their interactions with another group called Jesuits. And without getting into all the details, basically, you just have two forms of Catholicism fighting against each other. Both of them are very serious about their Catholicism, but they have these kind of, what to our perspective is minor differences between in their ideas of free will, of God's grace. And it's the fight is even more bitter because Europe is now Protestant, or parts of Europe are now Protestant, and that's an option. And France has just murdered or chased out tens of thousands of their own Protestants. So it really matters now, these little religious differences. Again, one reason why it matters so much is because there is blood in the water, so to speak. And people in France are very concerned. And it shows in a way that the French, not everything is right in the French church. Let's put it that way. You might look outwardly and say France is the center. Everyone speaks French. The French love their Catholicism. They have beautiful cathedrals. They have very learned, French theologians, brilliant French writers, all kinds of things. But if you really get into it, you realize these French thinkers are not agreeing with each other, and they are very brutally sometimes attacking each other within the Christian house, within the Catholic house even. These two groups of Christians are attacking each other, trying to demolish each other's kind of cathedrals and monasteries, and trying to chase each other out of France. That's kind of the main point, is with these Jansenists and these Jesuits. And so while that's simmering, we could say in the background, you have these voices coming out now. that are these three voices I wanted to talk about that are can kind of symbolize continental enlightenment. So we have Locke and Hobbes in England, but on the continent of Europe, we could say Voltaire, Rousseau, and Kant, Immanuel Kant, are three famous Enlightenment figures. And basically, Voltaire is very careful in what he says, but he is a skeptic, and he's constantly he's never on the line of blasphemy, but he's always right there and saying things that can be taken both ways. So he's always safe. He's not a very deep thinker, but he's a very brilliant writer. He's very witty. He's very easy to read and accessible, and he is kind of sharp. He's very sharp. When you read his writings, you realize that he's really holding Christianity under a microscope and and basically ridiculing a lot of these kind of ideas, a lot of traditional Christian ideas for their perceived immorality or for their lack of logic or for their lack of love or charity according to his own reasonable standard. He says, so basically in his mind, he's a very elitist also. Christianity might be okay for the rabble, but we, meaning we, here educated, thoughtful people, we can see that Christianity is not logical, and he's following in some ways Spinoza's old idea that religion is created by a class of priests to benefit themselves. Rousseau is another thinker who's a little more positive. He says, well, I don't want to just take away Christianity. I want to build a new religion of universal love, of universal brotherhood, following the will, the general will of humanity to build a new kind of utopia. But there is some coercive aspect to Rousseau too. This kind of general will, all people have to be under it, and there's some breakdown in his personal conduct with regard to this love. What this love would look like in a society is not clear. We knew that Rousseau was not great with his own. I mean, I think he gave up all 5 of his children to orphanages and refused to raise them. So what this kind of love looks like is hard to say, but the idea, at least you can see, is he's influential because he believes that people naturally have a good instinct and have love, and that some sort of society could be made without God, but with love, with charity, with kind of agreement and harmony. And then Kant is really the deepest thinker out of all three of these. He's a German, and also in some ways the most subtle, and probably because he's more profound and more subtle in his critique of Christianity. He never leaves Christianity. He never, unlike Rousseau and Voltaire, he doesn't argue or doesn't mock Christianity, but in a very logical kind of way, he takes apart. Like he says, he's taking apart Christianity to make room for faith. He's making room for faith because he's pointing out that a lot of the things that Christians say that they believe and can understand, they actually cannot really explain in logical terms. That they have to be taken by faith. So many elements of the Christian truth have to be taken only on faith, and that if you really get down to it, basically, that we can't understand the way our minds work, and we can't understand how we make sense of the world. We have no choice but to think, for instance, in terms of cause and effect, that maybe the world doesn't really work in cause and effect. Maybe time is an illusion, but we just have to think that way. And we have to build this whole world out of that. And when you realize that this whole world is that way, that we only have what our limited minds can handle, that then you realize that Christian truths, ideas like infinity, like, are way beyond us. How can we even understand what does it mean to say God is love? We don't understand that what love is. It has to be understood as a matter of faith. So in some ways, he was very open, like the book suggests. Some Christian mystics would have been very happy with him. They would have said, well, yeah, we've agreed this all along. And it could be that Kant himself had some appreciation for this kind of mystical aspect. But the teeth of his argument, where it's really cutting, is that then we should stop talking at all, he would say, because it's not reasonable to say that God is good, that God is love, that God is powerful. None of those things matter anymore because our reason is not really able to understand what it means. In other words, we can only talk about love and good and power in very human terms, in terms that humans can understand, and not extrapolate that onto God, if that makes sense. And so between these three, amongst all these groups, you kind of have some of the more significant and famous elite articulations or explanations of what enlightenment is. In general, all of these things are acting. You can see how all three of these writers, even though they have very different perspectives, all three of them are making more space for a world in which you can be European and you can be thoughtful and you can not subscribe to traditional Christian beliefs. You cannot be just simply believe them or take them as the standard. So then, as we were heading to, we're going to finally, the last two sections, talk about the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, basically, in the end, you have these longer term trends, and then you have kind of, you could say, pure chance. The fact that Louis XVI was so indecisive, the fact that he could not manage better politically the kind of pressures that were on him. The short story is that the French government was completely bankrupted by the American Revolution, by its participation in helping America achieve revolution. The French never created a good banking system or good taxation system the way British could. And so the French king, for all his power and for all the glory of France, had very little ways to get money. And when it came down to it, he bungled it so badly again and again that eventually the most radical voices within French society took control of the basically the conversation, took control of the political power, and one of the things that they did, because they were the most radical voices, because he refused to act and couldn't create a good coalition with the many other voices who probably would have preferred, probably, if they really could have had time and if he had just been a little bit more adept, they would have created a much more moderate solution, a kind of like in Great Britain, a kind of constitutional monarchy where the king survives, has some powers, works together with the parliament, works together with and raises money, and everyone's happy, right? There's votes and all that, and the church stays just like it is, okay? No problem. But because he handled it so poorly, basically, things got spiraled out of his control, and although the role of religion in this is that these radical voices, one of the first things they did is they took the very radical, strong step of creating a civil constitution for the clergy, which, bottom line is, it's saying in this very Catholic country, again, where, and in Europe, which is still very Catholic, there's a lot of Catholic strength at the grassroots. Europe, part of the irony of the European story is just when Europe was truly Catholic, it broke apart into Protestant and secular, and so a lot of the people really did believe in had their faith and really bought into it, really cared for it, and just at that moment, these kind of strong voices, these radical voices from the French, among the French leaders, are saying we're going to completely separate ourselves from the Pope, basically, and we're going to create a true state church, kind of like England, where it's totally under the control of the Parliament and of the French people. And again, for a loyal, for a good, pious Catholic, I mean, this is complete, complete. This is total blasphemy. It's completely a revolution and an insult to what it means to be a Catholic, to be connected to the world church, to be connected to the Pope, to be connected to this kind of ancient tradition of the church and all its lineage and to say that now the king controls the church completely and all church properties belong, or not the king, but the state, right? The French state controls all church properties. That was a big problem. And so in this kind of backlash, back and forth, this whipsawing back and forth between people who wanted to preserve the church, people who wanted to completely confiscate all the church's belongings, we have the French Revolution with a lot of blood, with a lot of priests being murdered, with a lot of resentment among people, and the kind of miserable state church trying to walk this fine line, established by the state but hated by the good Catholics who just want to continue their religion. And in this kind of chaos and turmoil, Napoleon Bonaparte steps in, takes control to much acclaim. At least he's decisive. He's winning victories overseas, and he's not overseas. I mean, over in French territories against French enemies, and he's establishing kind of the glory of this French Republic. And one of the things he recognizes right away is that one of the big mistakes from the very beginning, like I've pointed out, because of the bungling of Louis XVI, one of the big mistakes was to try to attack the Catholic Church head on, to get rid of it. They should not have allowed those radical voices to force the clergy to all subscribe to the civil constitution. They should not have tried to confiscate all the church lands and property. And so he restores it. He allows the Pope to kind of ceremonially be part of his coronation. He asks the Pope to discover a Saint Napoleon for him, and he kind of brings France back into this kind of uneasy synthesis. And to move into the last section, which is called Aftermath of Revolution, Europe of Nation States, one of the lasting impacts of revolution of Napoleon and of this period is that one reason why Napoleon was so successful is because he was building on this French Revolution. And this French Revolution basically claimed that all citizens, all French people were automatically citizens. Everyone born in France and with this common language and tongue, with this common history, is a French citizen. And so is because you buy in, because you are a citizen, because you have rights, because you are part of the reason that the government has its right, it not from God but from the citizens, then you also have to defend your nation. It's your nation, so you have to defend it. So he could conscript soldiers. I mean, he could draw up Frenchmen, unlike older forms of professional soldiers, or kind of a knightly class or things like that. He just, every single able-bodied French man is automatically part of Napoleon's army, or can be called upon to be part of Napoleon's army. And so this is the beginning of this kind of nation state, the no longer religion. And again, working with these economic changes, which are bringing people out of the villages into the cities as part of this earlier kind of first wave of industrial revolution. People are working in cities now, and they're away from their past religion, away from all the people who knew them. Life had been formed very much by, we know who you are, we know who your parents are, we know who your grandparents are, and so on and so forth. You have the same culture, the same religion, and all these things because of them. But now you're in these new cities. The thing that ties people together in Europe more and more is not so much religion, but the state and this idea of nationality. And part of that is this fraternity, this brotherhood. Again, they use masculine terms. I mean, in French, it's also fraternité. That common humanity among all the people, especially of the same nation. How we're all Americans. We're all in this together. That idea is also going to creep into this socialism, and into this idea of maybe especially all the oppressed of the worker, all the oppressed and the lowly of the world are all together in a kind of brotherhood, where they care for each other. And of course, that leads us to the end of this chapter, where we're finally ending up with Karl Marx, who is really the high point of this development of social thought, of socialist thought. But he's marrying it to a very Christian idea of apocalypticism and utopia, right? Like, where the communist revolution is like the coming apocalypse, the reckoning, the justice of all things, and then also the utopia, the communist state that's established, will be this perfect state of justice and harmony. So even as we leave Christianity and Christian themes and create secular or even atheist ideas, like with Marx, right? Marx is specifically atheist and against Christianity, but there's a way in which these themes always return again and again. So it's hard to say what's truly secular. I mean, doesn't a Marxist believe in a utopia? Doesn't a Marxist believe in an end time? In a way, that's the case. So this is our section on Enlightenment. Thank you for being patient and sticking with us.